right, so today we're going to take a little step away from biology and step just a moment into a little bit of geology. Just finished watching Jurassic Park a couple minutes ago, so I figured it's a really good thing to think about dinosaurs. But anyway, the whole idea about this particular video is to kind of introduce you, or sort of reintroduce you, into the fossil record, how fossils are formed, how we date them or give an age to fossils, and kind of what that means in terms of the whole context of biology. So, early discoveries of fossils really threw people for a loop. This is where our actual mythology of things like ogres and giants and dragons and griffins and things like that all come from, is that as people were starting to discover these sorts of bones in their backyard, can you imagine digging that bad boy up in your yard? But as people were starting to discover these, they had to start to come up with explanations for what these crazy fossils mean. Before the 1700s or so, it was sort of assumed that life on Earth in the past was similar to life on Earth today, but through the 1800s, people started to have to recognize that some things in the past really weren't what we saw anymore. And so this really contradicted a lot of people's ideas about creationism and things along those lines. And it really made people start to grapple with that idea of, well, what happened to creatures that fell off the ark, so to speak? And fossils was the big part of what this was. So as they developed understanding of the fossil record, we had to start to kind of get understanding more about what fossils were. So let's talk about how fossils are made. A fossil is defined as any sort of leftover trace of an animal's existence. It could be the body itself, bones, that's our kind of common kind. Could be imprints, tracks, things like that. It can include anything about their behavior, including nests or eggs, which is always kind of fun to find. It could be drag marks or fur imprints. It could even be poop. Yeah, it really can be. It's called coprolites when you study that stuff. But what's kind of nice about when we find actual cast or petrified body parts, because that gives us direct evidence of physical adaptations. And as we get better about understanding how the body works, we can tell a lot more about the angles of certain kinds of bones and whether or not that means that particular animal was bipedal, or whether it walked, or whether it ran, or whether it flew, or whether it flopped. I mean, there's a lot of things that we understand now about the skeleton that we can start to infer some behavioral things, their physical adaptations, about how they were built in the past and what some of the things they may have encountered as challenges in the past. So one kind of evidence would be fossil tracks or traces. These are things that form especially well in mud, obviously, and it's kind of a difficult condition to have mud form, then dry out enough to kind of preserve those things without getting washed away again. But we can do some things with indirect evidence with these guys too. We can kind of tell whether or not a creature was walking or running by whether or not the weight's on the back or the front of their foot. We can tell some different kind of feeding behaviors of things. We can even tell some things that might be a little bit deeper, like family relationships. It looks right here, these are hominids, early bipedal humans. Looks like a young one and a grown-up one walking together, maybe hand in hand. Hard to say. But it does give us more different kinds of ideas in terms of some of the things that they did, different than the body parts. We can also find molds like imprints, things like that, either imprints of shells or imprints of leaves, things like that. What's kind of nice about these sorts of things is that they do give us some more ideas about soft body tissues. We can't directly tell what their tissues were like, but it can give us more of their shape. For example, it's really hard to find the fossil of jellyfish. Not much of them really fossilize. Same thing with leaves. Wood, yes, but leaves, it's a little bit more difficult. Feathers, things like that. It gives us a little bit more idea of what happens when that body just dissolves and leaves sort of a print behind. It's not a footprint. It's an actual body print of the animal, and that's kind of cool to find those sorts of things. We can also find whole organisms, which is kind of neat when sometimes the whole creature gets preserved, either through, say, being frozen in the ice. This dude up here, Bogman, was actually buried in a peat bog, like a swamp almost, but sort of acidic without a lot of oxygen, so the body doesn't really decay. They could dry out, say, simply in a desert, or even get caught in amber. Any of these particular cases, we can get a lot more information about a creature because the whole body is there. We can even get DNA samples. We can even find, like in the Bogman, we can find traces of things like shoes, clothing, things along those lines, weapons and stuff like that. But we can get DNA samples even, and body parts, tissue parts, and kind of find out how they were actually put together, not just their outside parts, but really the full three-dimensional picture of this. There are some limitations to the fossil record that you should probably know about, and I just want to kind of go over that for a second. Fossil record's not perfect. For example, we can learn a lot about it, but can you imagine if all we knew about you was through a couple of photographs that we'd found of you? Just a couple of snapshots. Let's say, even this kind of rarity idea, if we were to try to record your whole life in photographs, not a lot of your life is really recorded, and not of a lot of the things around you are really recorded. And if we were to try to figure out your entire life's history, even if you've only been alive for 15 years, if we only had 3 pictures picked at random times from your entire life, what would we know about you? Well, that's what we're trying to sort of do with animals or plants or things like that in the past. Trying to figure out what sorts of ways that they live, their behaviors, their activities, what sorts of things they interacted with. And it's difficult to do that. Furthermore, the conditions to actually take those snapshots, the conditions to make fossils where an organism is buried relatively quickly and then not redisturbed for thousands of years, that's pretty rare on Earth. How many things die out every day in your backyard, for example, and don't get fossilized? So again, it's pretty unusual. Furthermore, small things and soft-bodied things tend to not get fossilized very well, or fossilized soft body parts aren't very often. So things like feathers and fur aren't very common. Bugs and some of those sorts of things aren't very common. We don't have a lot of fossil worms, for example. But jellyfish, like I said earlier, those sorts of things, we don't tend to see those as much. So we tend to get kind of a skewed image of what the fossil record is. Big things, shelled things, things with big bones, big teeth. We tend to know a lot more about those than the smaller creatures. So again, it gets a little bit difficult to get a whole picture of an ecosystem from the fossil record. And then finally, the last part, we're only getting body parts. Sometimes it's hard to tell a lot about what something does or how it lives or how it interacts in its ecosystem or anything like that from just its body parts. We don't know necessarily a lot about its traits, like how it moves, whether it's quick or slow, what it smelled like, what color it could even be, or what its texture might be, or what it ate. Those things are hard to tell from just the body parts. So we have to start to kind of be real creative in how we interpret the fossil record, and sometimes we have to say, I just don't know. So dinosaurs, what color were they? We can't say. We have some ideas, but we're not entirely sure. So moving on. In terms of putting dates to fossils, there's two major ways that we can put dates on fossils. There's a relative way, and then there's the absolute way. Relative simply tells us whether or not something's older or younger. So we can tell that this fossil definitely lived and died long before this other fossil did, which has its own kind of uses to it. It tells us sequencing, things like that. Absolute dating, on the other hand, gives us an actual year. It gives us an actual value for when that creature lived. 2,000, 10,000, 10 million years ago. That's what absolute dating can do for us. In terms of how these are done, relative dating is kind of simple and kind of hard. In the simple sense, it's just a principle of layering. It's called superposition. New dirt is laid down on top of old dirt. It's kind of a duh idea. But the fact that if we take a look down, if we were to dig straight down in an area, these top layers right here must have died more recently than the further down we dig where the older layers are. And this is pretty much always true. There are some variations to this. For example, you can kind of see there's like a fault section right here where an area got busted and shifted due to Earth's movements. You get some of these places where you get actual bending in the rock layers, so you can get some kind of weird things happening. Erosion, for example, right in here, you can get some spots where you may not get complete layers that are happening. So again, that's still that basic idea that if we find this fish fossil down here, it's older, lived a long time ago compared to this fish fossil, which lived longer ago than this reptile fossil, whatever the case may be. So again, it can give us a real big picture of stuff in an area. And what's handy about this is that we can actually take a look at profiles from different areas and start to kind of correlate them, that we look for similar rock layers as well as similar fossil layers, and we can get different spots where maybe there's an incomplete record here and an incomplete record here. We can see how they overlap and get a really good, fairly thorough three-dimensional picture. A lot of parts of Colorado, for example, have this, where you can see different ages of rock layers. Think about that place where you drive through on Interstate 70, where you can see all those black lines, those layers of rocks. Well, we know that those correlate to other parts of the state, and so that can give us an idea of roughly how old or how young certain rock layers are. Now, radioactive dating, isotopes, is a different kind of thing entirely. This is a method of absolute dating, so we can get actual years from this. So radioisotopes is kind of what it sounds like. It's a radioactive isotope. An isotope is just a form of an atom. The one you're most familiar with is probably called carbon-14. You've probably heard of that. And it's just a form of carbon that happens to be a little unusual. It's kind of rare, and it's radioactive. It breaks down over time. But we know how fast it breaks down, and that rate is called its half-life. Half-life is a really critical idea here. Half-life is defined as how long it takes for half of something that's radioactive to break down. So if we started off with 10 grams, how long would it take it to break down to 5 grams? And that gives us an idea of how many years it is. And that's a real consistent thing. Depends on which element it is. So for example, carbon-14, half of it breaks down after 5,730 years. And another one that we use in dating called potassium-40, its half-life is closer to 1.3 billion years. But it's consistently, potassium-40 is always 1.3 billion years. So every time 1.3 billion years passes, another half of it decays. So that's something that we can use. So let's take a look at kind of an example of how this process works. So here's a graph that kind of looks like the decay of carbon-14. So let's say you started at year 0 when something died. it had 10 grams of carbon-14 in it. Carbon-14 comes from your food, it comes from your environment, it's naturally occurring, but as soon as you die, you stop taking in fresh carbon-14, so the overall rate starts to break down, or overall amount, I guess. So let's say you died here at year 0. We know that after one half-life, half of that carbon will have broken down, so you will have gone from 10 grams to 5 grams. Now, how long is that? That's one half-life. By definition, because half of it's gone. And in terms of carbon-14, we know that that half-life is 5,730 years. That's just what it's defined as. Now, after another 5,730 years, the second half-life, we know that half of it's going to break down again. So you had 5 grams at 5,730 years. When another 5,730 years passes, you'll have 2.5 grams. And then after another half-life, 1.25 grams. Every 5,000 years, it breaks by half. So this is not really good for really, really old fossils. This one, because it breaks down relatively quickly, 5,000 years doesn't sound like that quick, but compared to life on Earth, it's relatively quick. This is best for archaeological fossils, fossil record of humankind on Earth, our cultural fossils, or for very young fossils from the last several thousand years. So in terms of how do we do this, here's a sample problem that you should be able to do. So take a look at this graph, see if you can answer these, hit pause. See if you can work it out, and then I'll show you the answers there under this blue square here. So hit pause right now, read your problems, see if you can figure out what the choices are. Okay, welcome back. So, how much C14 would be an organism that's 4 half-lives old? Well, I'll move this over to the side here. So 4 half-lives, it's over here. If 1.25 was left at 3 half-lives, then at 4 half-lives, half of it would be gone, so you'd have 0.75 grams would be left after 3 half-lives. There you go. If an organism only had 1.25 grams of C14 remaining, how old is it? Well, 1.25 grams is 3 half-lives old. So how old is 3 half-lives? Well, 3 half-lives is 5,730 times 3, or about 17,000 years old. And then the last question, what's the oldest object that we could date more or less with carbon-14? If we have 0.1 gram of carbon-14 left, assuming that that's what we can date, you just have to kind of keep going in half. 1.25 divided by 2 is 0.75 divided by 2 divided by 2 again. Eventually you get down to the point of 7 half-lives. You have less than 0.1 gram left, and that's about 40,000 years. So this is really only good for about 40,000 years of carbon-14 dating. So how do we date with stuff that's older than that? Well, that's where we use potassium. Potassium-argon dating is a little bit better for really, really old stuff, especially rocks and really, really ancient fossils. This is called potassium-argon dating because the radioactive form of potassium breaks down into argon, hence the name. But it's exactly the same in terms of that idea of breakdown, half, 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 except that the half-life time is much longer, 1.3 billion years. So here you go, one half-life right here, that's got to be about 1.3 billion years. A second half-life, double that. It's about 2.5 billion years. Triple that, right? It's about 3.8 billion years or so. So again, each half-life, the same idea. It's just this allows us to go much older in terms of what it is. So you just need to know that idea of a half-life graph. Can you interpret that? And can you kind of understand, especially carbon-14 is what I'd ask you, but recognize that potassium argon is another type of the same kind of dating. Okay, so all these pieces put together, looking at the fossil record, looking at relative dating, looking at absolute dating, we can now look back at the whole entirety of Earth's history and divide it into a whole variety of different eras and periods. And eras are really, really big periods of time. And like this is, like the Precambrian era is singular celled. The Paleozoic era is well, it's basically life in water for the most part. Really kind of non-bony creatures, non-vertebrates. The Mesozoic, we start to get to see vertebrates and land. And then the Cenozoic is kind of what we would consider the sort of the modern history of things more or less as we would recognize them, including the last ice ages and so. But this timeline that we see is consistent across Earth. There is no place on Earth where the parts of this are in a different order. This is actually a pretty powerful history for evolution of life on Earth, that this is really, really consistent. Wherever we see fossils, we see them in roughly the same eras, roughly the same periods, smaller chunks of eras across the entire planet. Some of those major events, again, you can kind of look at this, hit pause if you want to look at it a little bit more clearly. But in terms of time, we've got single-celled, multi-celled kind of coming up. We've got sort of that aquatic life, not even fish really. We've got the evolution of bones and skeletons kind of going on in this region. Coming up onto land, our first land creatures, although there's still plenty of life in the ocean. And then our first megafauna, our really, really big dinosaurs and creatures up here. And then the age of the mammals is way up in this top part up here, where they are really taking dominance. And then we're only this very last little bit, just the tiny tiniest little slice, the Quaternary period, has been anything resembling our human history. The couple of big boundaries on here, the KT boundary, end of the dinosaurs. The end of the dinosaurs, we're pretty sure, is due to an asteroid impact and the climate change that went with that. Lots of other things went extinct as well, but all of the dinosaur family, other than the birds and some of the other pre-reptiles, basically gone. Before that, we had something called the PT boundary. And this is a big 90% huge extinction on Earth's history. I'm not exactly sure why this is, but we know there was a huge drop in oxygen in the ocean. Something was using up all that oxygen and nearly wiped out the planet. It was pretty amazing to think about that. We had some other early ones too as well. About 2.5 billion years ago, we had the first oxygen. This is when photosynthesis happened. This was really catastrophic as well. 90 to 95% of the species of Earth went extinct over this period of time. And then way back when, Earth formation, quite a long time ago. So these are things that happened way back in our history, but this kind of stuff is a pretty consistent pattern across there. So did dinosaurs ever enjoy the smell of flowers? Most likely not. There's the first flowering plants were right near the end of the dinosaurs, so there may have been some overlap there, but probably the flowers were not real big at that particular time, pollinated by bugs and things like that. And did cavemen ever meet dinosaurs like in Fred Flintstone? Definitely not. There's thousands of years difference in time between when hominids, our ancestors, walked the earth and when the last reptiles walked the earth. The last dinosaurs and the first mammals were very, very different creatures. The first mammals back then were like squirrels. So I guarantee you there was nothing that even looked like a primate back then. So there you have it. Here's our big ideas from today, that there's a variety of different ways that fossils form, that the fossil record, because of the way that the fossils form, is very incomplete, and there's a variety of different things that we have to kind of take into account when we're interpreting fossils. We can date fossils using a variety of different methods. Relatively, we use stratigraphy, the idea that old stuff is at the bottom and new stuff is on the top. We can use radioisotopes and half-life to date things with carbon or with potassium, depending on how old they are, and that half-life is defined as the amount of time it takes for half of that stuff to decay. Finally, we can take a look at the whole Earth history, the whole fossil record, stratigraphy, absolute dating, and we can divide our Earth's history into a variety of major periods, major areas that are very similar across the entire Earth, that really allow us to kind of get a big picture of how Earth came to be the way it is today. So if you want some ideas for a 4, there they are at the bottom. I'll see you in class tomorrow.